I never thought betrayal would come from the very children I once held against my chest, the ones whose cries I soothed in the dead of night, the ones I sacrificed decades of my life to raise. But life has a cruel way of showing us that the sharpest knives are not always held by strangers, they are often clutched by the hands we once kissed. My name is Eleanor Grace Whitmore. I am 68 years old, and this is the story of how my world unraveled after I buried my husband. Richard and I had built a life together, simple but steady. Hazelbrook Orchards wasn't just land, it was the heartbeat of our marriage, the soil in which we planted not just apple trees, but our dreams, our memories, our future. When we first took over the land from his parents, it was barely breaking even. But with time, sweat, and an endless stream of small sacrifices, we transformed it. The orchard wasn't grand in the eyes of the world, but in ours it was everything. Each blossom in the spring felt like a promise. Each harvest in the fall felt like an answered prayer. I still remember the way Richard used to walk the rows at dawn, coffee in hand, touching the trees as though greeting old friends. He used to joke that the orchard had raised him just as much as his parents had. And in some ways it raised me too. It taught me patience, resilience, humility. It taught me that growth comes slowly, but when nurtured, it can be abundant beyond measure. Richard was a good man. Quiet, steady, the kind of man who didn't speak much but whose presence filled a room. When cancer took him, it wasn't sudden, it was a long, brutal erosion. I watched the man I loved wither, his strong hands growing thin, his laughter fading into silence. And through it all, I cared for him. Every treatment, every hospital visit, every sleepless night, those final years became the hardest work I had ever done. When he finally passed, part of me felt relief that his suffering was over, but the rest of me was hollow like the orchard in winter, stripped bare of life. The funeral was small but heartfelt. Neighbors came, men with dirt still under their fingernails, women who had baked casseroles and pies to carry us through the weeks ahead. I stood by the casket, numb, my black dress hanging loose on my frame. My children stood beside me. Darren, my eldest, now 44, his suit sharp, and his hair slicked back with that air of ambition he'd carried since he was a boy. Samantha, 38, graceful, polished, with the kind of practiced charm that made people believe she was kinder than she truly was. They looked the part of grieving children, but I felt something colder in the way they carried themselves that day. Their hugs were brief, their eyes calculating. I brushed it off as grief, it does strange things to people. But in my gut, I knew something was different. Something in their posture told me that they weren't just mourning their father. They were recalculating their future. 3 days after the funeral, Darren offered to drive me home from the lawyer's office, where we had finalized the reading of Richard's will. It was a crisp winter afternoon, the kind where the air bites at your skin, but the sun still tries to shine. I slid into the passenger seat, grateful for his company, though something in his silence made my stomach uneasy. We drove out of town, past the familiar landmarks of Hazelbrook, past the diner where Richard and I used to have breakfast on Sundays, past the church, whose bells had just tolled for his farewell. Soon the road narrowed, trees thickening on either side. "Why are we going this way?" I asked, glancing at Darren's hands gripping the wheel tighter than usual. He didn't answer right away. The car hummed, the tires crunching over gravel as we veered farther from the main road. Finally, he cleared his throat. "Mom, things are going to change. The orchard, it's time to let it go." I felt my chest tighten. "What do you mean, let it go? That orchard is our life. It's land, Mom." He cut me off, his tone sharp, impatient. "Land that developers are willing to pay millions for. You can't keep clinging to it like it's sacred. Dad's gone. It's time to be practical." I stared at him, unable to process. Darren, my little boy who once built forts between the apple trees, who used to climb ladders to pick fruit with his father, now speaking of our orchard like it was a disposable commodity. "And Samantha agrees," he added coldly. "We've already spoken with some people. There's no sense dragging this out." The words hit me like blows. My hands trembled in my lap. "Spoken with people without me." He sighed as though I were a child throwing a tantrum. "You're not thinking clearly right now. You've just lost Dad. Sam and I, we can handle the details. You just need to step aside." step aside, as though I were nothing more than an obstacle to be moved out of the way. The car slowed, pulling onto a desolate stretch of road that wound between frost-bitten fields. Darren stopped, shifted into park, and turned to me with a look I'll never forget, calm, firm, resolute. "This is where you get off, Mom." For a moment I thought I had misheard him, what I whispered. "You don't have to come with us for this part," he said. "We'll handle the sale. You'll be taken care of. Don't make this harder than it has to be." I stared at him, my pulse pounding in my ears. My own son, abandoning me on a remote road, speaking as though my life's work, my marriage, my sacrifices meant nothing. I fumbled with the door handle, my hands shaking so badly I could barely push it open. The cold air slapped me as I stepped out, the gravel crunching beneath my shoes. Darren didn't look at me again. He just drove away, the taillights glowing red until they vanished around the bend. I stood there alone, the winter wind cutting through my coat. My body trembled not just from the cold, but from the crushing weight of betrayal. This was my family, my children, the ones I had poured everything into. And now they had cast me aside as though I were no longer needed, no longer valued, no longer theirs. But as I stood on that desolate road, one truth rose above the grief. They had underestimated me. They thought I was old, fragile, powerless. They had forgotten that beneath the gray hair and weary bones was the woman who had built Hazelbrook orchards from nothing, who had endured storms and droughts, who had survived cancer by proxy as it ravaged her husband. They thought they had written me out of the story, but they didn't know I still held the pen. I walked along that desolate road for nearly an hour before a passing farmer recognized me and offered me a ride back into town. His truck smelled of hay and tobacco, and though he asked nothing more than, "You all right, Eleanor?" I could see the pity in his eyes. I nodded, but inside I was screaming. Nothing about me was all right. My son had left me on the side of the road like an inconvenience, like a discarded package no one wanted to claim. By the time I made it home, the house felt colder than usual. Richard's jacket still hung by the door, his boots lined neatly on the mat. I pressed my face against the worn fabric, breathing in the faint scent of him, trying to ground myself. But no matter how tightly I clung to that jacket, I couldn't shake the reality pressing against me. My children were no longer mine in the way I had always believed. I made tea and sat at the kitchen table, the steam rising between my trembling hands. Memories flooded me, each one cutting deeper than the last. Darren, as a boy, chasing after Richard in the orchard, shouting, "Wait for me, Dad." Samantha sitting cross-legged on the floor drawing pictures of apple trees and begging me to hang them on the fridge. They were my whole world, and for so long I believed I was theirs too. I remembered the nights I stayed awake sewing Samantha's dresses for school dances because we couldn't afford store-bought ones. I remembered the long weekends Darren spent at basketball tournaments and how I scraped together gas money to drive across the state, cheering until my throat went raw. I remembered sitting at the kitchen table long after the children were asleep, calculating bills and wondering which one I could afford to pay late. Richard would take my hand and whisper, "We'll make it, Ellie. We always do." And somehow we did. So how had love turned into this? How had devotion, sacrifice, and endless giving transformed into cold calculations and betrayal? For days after that drive, I wandered the orchard like a ghost. The trees were bare, their branches etched against the winter sky. I trailed my fingers along their bark, whispering to them as if they could hear me. "You are mine. You've always been mine. I won't let them take you." But deep inside, fear gnawed at me. My children had already spoken with developers. They had power of attorney paperwork Richard had signed in his final months. Paperwork I had trusted them to use for medical and financial emergencies, not for selling our legacy. Had I been blind? Or had grief made me too willing to believe they still had pure intentions? I called Harold, our family lawyer. He had been Richard's friend since boyhood, a man with a slow drawl and sharp eyes that missed nothing. When I told him what Darren had said, his sigh was heavy. "I feared this might happen," he said. "Your children see the orchard as numbers, not roots. But Eleanor, you're not powerless. You still own land in your maiden name, don't you?" I blinked. "Yes. The 20 acres Richard added to my name years ago with the stream running through it. We kept it separate in case of emergencies." Harold's voice sharpened. That water is the orchard's lifeline. Without it, no sale can go through. Developers might buy the land, but without rights to that water, they're holding a dying orchard. You have leverage, Eleanor, more than you think. A spark flared in my chest. For the first time in days, hope pushed against the grief. Darren and Samantha believed I was powerless, just an old widow clinging to memories. But they had forgotten something Richard never did. I wasn't weak. I wasn't fragile. I was steel wrapped in kindness, and when pushed too far, steel does not bend. That night I sat by the fire with a pen and journal, writing down every thought, every plan. The anger inside me had transformed into something sharper, cleaner. This wasn't just about saving land. This was about reclaiming myself, about refusing to be erased by the very children I had brought into this world. I thought of Richard, his steady voice in my ear. "You've always been the strong one, Ellie. Stronger than you know." And I realized that he had been right. Grief had blinded me, but betrayal had opened my eyes. Still, my heart ached. Because even as I planned to fight, I couldn't stop seeing Darren as a boy, sitting on Richard's shoulders, laughing at the world from up high. I couldn't stop remembering Samantha sneaking into our bed during thunderstorms, her small body trembling until I wrapped her in my arms. How had those innocent children turned into people who could cast me aside so easily? Was it my fault? Had I spoiled them with too much giving, too much shielding from the harshness of life? The questions circled like vultures, but no answer could dull the sting of betrayal. 2 days later, Samantha arrived at the house unannounced. She swept in wearing a designer coat, her perfume filling the room. She kissed my cheek as though nothing had happened, then sat at the table and began laying out papers. "Mom, Darren and I have everything ready. The developers are offering an incredible deal, more money than you'll ever need. You'll be comfortable for the rest of your life." Her voice was smooth, coaxing, but beneath it I heard the steel. This wasn't about comfort for me, it was about greed for them. I stared at the papers, then at her. "And what about the orchard? What about your father's legacy?" She waved her manicured hand dismissively. "Legacies don't pay bills, Mom. This is the smart move. Dad would have wanted us to be practical." The audacity of her words made my hands tremble. "Your father loved this land more than anything. Don't you dare use his name to justify this." Her smile faltered, but only for a moment. "Mom, you're tired. You don't need the stress of all this. Let us handle it." I looked at her, really looked at her. At the daughter I had once held against my chest, who now saw me as nothing more than a stumbling block in her path to wealth. And in that moment, something inside me hardened into certainty. I would not let them take this from me. I folded the papers neatly, slid them back across the table, and said quietly, "No." Her eyes widened, shocked at the firmness in my voice. "What do you mean, no?" "I mean no," I repeated. "You will not sell Hazelbrook Orchards. Not now, not ever." Her face twisted with frustration. "You can't stop us, Mom. We already have the signatures." But she didn't know what I knew. She didn't know about the 20 acres in my name, about the water that gave life to the orchard. She didn't know that beneath my grief, strength was blooming like spring after winter. I didn't tell her then. I let her leave, fuming, papers clutched in her hand. But as the door shut behind her, I whispered into the empty room, "You've underestimated me." For the first time in weeks I smiled, not because the battle was won, but because I finally remembered who I was. The morning after Samantha stormed out, I rose before dawn. The house was silent, the kind of silence that presses on your skin until you want to scream. I wrapped myself in Richard's old flannel shirt, the one still smelling faintly of cedar and tobacco, and walked out to the orchard. Frost clung to the branches, tiny jewels glinting in the first light of day. For a moment I just stood there breathing, letting the stillness wrap around me like armor. I had spent my entire life nurturing this land, and in return it had nurtured me. Every scar on my hands, every wrinkle on my face was written by these trees. And now my own children wanted to trade it all for money they hadn't earned. My throat tightened, a sob clawing its way up, but I swallowed it down. Tears would not save Hazelbrook. Strength would. I thought back to when Darren was 10 years old. He had begged to plant his own apple tree. Richard helped him dig the hole, taught him how to pat the soil firm around the roots, and Darren had named the tree Victor, as if it were some great champion. That tree still stood, its branches twisted and strong. How could the boy who once watered it with a toy watering can become the man who now wanted to destroy it? And Samantha, my sweet girl, who once braided flowers into her hair and whispered to the bees because she believed they were her friends. She used to press apples into my hands and say, "Taste this one, Mom, it's the best." How could she now look at the orchard and see nothing but dollar signs? The memories cut deep, but they also fueled me. They reminded me that I hadn't imagined the love once shared. But love without respect corrodes, and theirs had rotted into entitlement. Later that day, I met Harold in his office. He looked over the forged documents Darren and Samantha had filed, his brow furrowing deeper with every page. "They've been clever," he admitted, "but not clever enough. These papers may have your late husband's signature, but the land title in your maiden name is untouched. They can't sell without your consent, Eleanor. And you hold the water rights. That's the true power here." His words steadied me, but they also terrified me. I had never been one for confrontation. I was the peacekeeper, the one who smoothed arguments and mended wounds. But now if I stayed silent, my silence would destroy everything Richard and I had built. "What do?" I asked, my voice trembling. "You let them reveal their greed," Harold said softly. "You let them show their hand. And then when the time comes, you strike. Quietly, firmly, legally. They think you're powerless. That's your greatest weapon." I left his office with my heart pounding, my resolve solidifying. That evening, Darren showed up. He didn't knock, he never did anymore. He strode into the kitchen, his presence filling the room like a storm. "Mom, we need to talk," he said, dropping a folder onto the table. "The buyers are ready. We just need your cooperation." I glanced at the folder but didn't touch it. "And if I say no?" He narrowed his eyes, a smirk tugging at his lips. "Then you'll be left with nothing but trees you can't manage. You're almost 70, Mom. Do you really think you can keep this place going alone?" His words stung because there was truth in them. My body ached more than it used to. My hands weren't as strong, my back not as straight. But strength isn't just measured in muscle. It's measured in will. And my will was stronger than his greed. "I've managed before," I said quietly. "I'll manage again." He laughed, shaking his head. "You're being ridiculous. We're offering you comfort, security, freedom. All you have to do is let go." "Let go!" The phrase echoed like a command, but I refused to obey. I stood meeting his gaze with a steadiness that surprised even me. "Darren, you may be my son, but you don't own me. And you don't own this orchard." His jaw tightened. He grabbed the folder, muttered something under his breath, and stormed out. The door slammed so hard the windows rattled. I sank back into my chair, my hands trembling but my heart steady. For the first time I had stood my ground. That night I dreamed of Richard. He was standing among the trees, the sunlight catching his hair, his face calm and sure. He reached for my hand and whispered, "Don't be afraid. You've always been the stronger one." I woke with tears on my cheeks, but also a fire in my chest. Over the next few days, the tension thickened. Samantha sent me emails long and flowery, trying to coax me into agreement. Darren was blunter, sending curt messages demanding I sign. Neighbors began to whisper news traveling fast in small towns. People avoided my gaze in the grocery store, unsure which side of the family drama to believe. But through it all, I walked the orchard each morning, touching the trees, reminding myself of what was at stake. This land wasn't just dirt and roots, it was memory, legacy, love. It was Richard's laughter, my children's childhoods, my own identity woven into every leaf. And then the letter came. A formal notice from the developers announcing their intent to purchase Hazelbrook Orchards, pending final signatures. They had included a copy of Darren and Samantha's forged agreement, as if to intimidate me. Instead, I smiled, because I knew what they didn't. Without the water rights, the land was useless to them, and those rights belonged to me alone. I folded the letter neatly and placed it in a drawer. The time for silence was ending. The time for action was near. That evening, I stood at the kitchen window watching the last light fade over the orchard. The branches swayed gently in the wind, like they were whispering encouragement. And I whispered back, "I won't let them take you. Not now, not ever." The tension finally broke on a gray Thursday morning. I was in the kitchen kneading bread, the way my mother had taught me when a black sedan pulled into the drive. Darren and Samantha stepped out, both dressed as though they were heading to a boardroom meeting, not their mother's farmhouse. Their faces were set determined, and my stomach twisted into knots. They didn't knock. They never did anymore. Darren strode in first, followed by Samantha, who carried a leather portfolio under her arm. The smell of their expensive cologne filled the room, clashing with the warm, yeasty air. "Mom, we need to settle this," Darren said, his voice clipped. "The developers are waiting. All we need is your signature on these papers and everything will be finalized. You'll walk away comfortable for the rest of your life." Samantha laid the portfolio on the table and opened it, spreading out the documents like a dealer laying down cards. "This is the best offer we'll ever get, Mom. Millions. Enough for you to hire caregivers. Travel, do whatever you want. Isn't that what you've always said? That you didn't want to be a burden?" A burden. The word sliced me open. My hands froze on the dough flour, clinging to my fingers. Was that truly how they saw me? Not as the mother who had sacrificed everything, but as a weight dragging them down. I wiped my hands on my apron and sat across from them, my heart pounding. "And what about Hazelbrook? What about your father's legacy? Do those millions bring him back? Do they replace the years of love and sweat we poured into this land?" Darren rolled his eyes. "Dad's gone, Mom. Holding on to this orchard doesn't bring him back. It's just dirt. Trees. Sentimentality doesn't pay the bills." Samantha's voice softened, as though she thought kindness could disguise betrayal. "We're not asking you to forget, Dad. We're just asking you to be practical, to let go." There it was again, let go. Always their refrain, always their demand. I leaned forward, my eyes locking onto theirs. "And what if I don't sign?" Silence fell heavy and suffocating. Darren's jaw clenched. "Then we move forward without you. We already have power of attorney from Dad's last months. We can use that." My breath caught, but I didn't let them see my fear. "You'd use your dying father's signature to betray his wishes." Darren didn't answer. Samantha looked away, shame flickering across her face, but not enough to stop her. I let the silence stretch, then I spoke, my voice low and steady. "You may have forged papers. You may think you've won. But there's something you don't know. Something your father and I planned for years ago." Their eyes snapped to mine, confusion flickering. "I still own 20 acres in my maiden name," I said. "And that land holds the only water source that keeps this orchard alive. Without it, the developers can buy all the acres they want, but they'll have nothing. Dry trees, dead land." Darren's face went pale, his confidence faltering. "What are you talking about?" Samantha shook her head, disbelief written across her features. "That's not possible. We checked the records." "You checked the wrong ones," I said, my voice sharper now. "Because you assumed I was powerless. You assumed I was too old, too broken, too lost in grief to protect what matters. But you were wrong. This orchard is mine, and it will remain mine. Not because of money, but because it is my life, my blood, my marriage, my story." The air crackled with tension. Darren's hands balled into fists. "You'd ruin this deal out of spite. You'd throw away millions just to prove a point." I rose from my chair, my hands trembling but my voice steady. "This isn't about spite. It's about respect. You wanted to cast me aside, to sell the soil your father died working, and to treat me like an obstacle. I will not fund my own erasure. I will not stand by while you destroy everything Richard and I built." Samantha's eyes filled with tears, but Darren's face hardened into stone. "Fine," he spat. "If you want to die with your precious orchard, so be it. Don't expect us to be here when it happens." They gathered their papers, slamming the portfolio shut. Darren stormed out, his footsteps echoing like gunshots. Samantha lingered for a moment, her eyes pleading, but she said nothing. She followed him, the door slamming behind her. I stood there alone, my body shaking, tears streaming down my cheeks. The bread dough on the counter had collapsed just as my heart had. But beneath the sorrow was something fierce, vindication. They finally knew. They finally saw that I wasn't powerless. That night, I walked the orchard under a full moon. The branches stretched toward the sky like guardians. I whispered to them, "I protected you. I'll always protect you." The cold air bit at my cheeks, but I felt stronger than I had in years. The next morning, Harold called. "I've filed the paperwork. The developers have been notified that without water rights, the sale is void. They're furious, but they can't touch you. The orchard is safe." I closed my eyes, relief washing over me. But it was bittersweet. I had saved Hazelbrook, but at what cost? My children were gone, their greed severing the bond we once shared. Still, as I stood in the kitchen window, watching the orchard bathe in morning light, I knew I had done the right thing. Some legacies are worth more than money. Some battles must be fought no matter the scars they leave. The days after Harold filed the paperwork passed in a blur. My phone rang endlessly angry calls from developers demanding explanations, accusatory messages from Darren, half-hearted apologies from Samantha. I ignored most of them. For the first time in my life, I wasn't scrambling to smooth things over. I wasn't bending myself into knots to make everyone else comfortable. I let the storm rage outside while I sat in my kitchen, a cup of tea in my hands, listening to the quiet power of my own resolve. The orchard was safe. The water rights tucked firmly under my maiden name stood like a shield. No one could touch Hazelbrook without me. And for the first time in months I felt a measure of peace. But peace has its price. Darren didn't come back. His last words echoed in my mind. Don't expect us to be here when it happens. My heart ached remembering the boy he once was. The child who used to run through the rows of trees, laughing as his father chased him. Where had that boy gone? How had he grown into a man who could abandon his own mother on a lonely road? Samantha at least wavered. She sent me emails late at night, words spilling with regret, but never quite forming an apology. I didn't know about the water rights. I didn't think it through. Maybe we should talk. I read them, but I didn't respond, not right away. Some wounds can't be patched with quick words. They need time-distance proof of change. One evening I found myself standing at Richard's grave. The winter air was sharp, the grass brittle underfoot. I laid a hand on the cold stone and whispered, I did it, Richard. I protected Hazelbrook. I kept your promise alive. The wind stirred through the trees, carrying the scent of earth and memory. And in that moment I felt him beside me, the quiet reassurance he had always carried, the steady strength he had always given. He had believed in me, even when I didn't believe in myself. Back at home, I lit a fire in the hearth and sat with the journal I had started again since his passing. I wrote down everything, the betrayal, the tears, the rage, the triumph. I poured my grief onto the page, but also my hope, because despite everything, I still loved my children. Even when they broke me, even when they saw me as nothing more than an obstacle, I couldn't extinguish the love that had raised them. But love without respect is a wound, and I could no longer bleed for them. A week later, Samantha showed up at the farmhouse. Her coat was simple this time, her eyes weary. She stood on the porch like a child waiting to be let in. When I opened the door, she whispered, Mom, can we talk? We sat at the kitchen table, the same table where she had once laid out contracts with greedy hands. This time, her fingers twisted nervously in her lap. I don't know what came over me, she said softly. I let Darren push me. I let money blind me. I forgot what this place means. What you mean? Her eyes glistened. I'm so sorry. Tears pricked my eyes, but I stayed silent, letting her words settle. After a moment, I reached across the table and took her hand. Samantha, I will always love you, but love must be built on respect. If you want to rebuild it, has to start there. She nodded, squeezing my hand as tears slipped down her cheeks. For the first time in months, I felt a thread of hope. Fragile, tentative, but real. Darren, though, remained distant. He sent one letter, curt and angry, accusing me of selfishness. I folded it away in a drawer, unwilling to let his bitterness poison the peace I had fought for. Maybe one day he would see the truth. Maybe one day he would return. But until then, I couldn't let his absence undo me. The orchard began to stir with life again as spring approached. Buds swelled on the branches, the promise of blossoms just weeks away. I walked the rows each morning, the sun warming my face, the earth soft beneath my boots. The trees seemed to whisper encouragement, their resilience a mirror of my own. Neighbors came by to help, their kindness reminding me I wasn't alone. They had heard whispers of what had happened, and though no one asked directly, their presence spoke volumes. One old farmer clasped my shoulder and said, You're tougher than most of us, Eleanor. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise. That night, as I stood on the porch watching the stars prick the sky, I realized something profound. My children had tried to erase me, to push me aside to sell the story of my life for profit, but they hadn't succeeded. Because I had found my voice. I had remembered my worth. And no amount of betrayal could take that from me again. This is the lesson I carry now, and the one I want to share with you, whoever you are, wherever you're listening from. Family can wound us more deeply than anyone else. But even in the face of betrayal, you are not powerless. You hold the pen to your story. You decide when to bend and when to stand tall. I am Eleanor Grace Whitmore. I am a widow, a mother, a survivor. I am the keeper of Hazelbrook Orchards, and I will not be erased. If my story has touched you, if you've ever felt the sting of betrayal or the ache of being unseen, I hope you'll stay with me. Like this video, share it with someone who needs the reminder, and subscribe so you don't miss the next story. And please leave a comment below. Tell me when you found your own strength, when you remembered that your story still belongs to you. Because your story matters, and your voice deserves to be heard.